I call Ron Mack.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to take a short call on behalf of New Zealand First on the Building Pools Amendment Bill. A couple of things that we noted in our discussions in caucus about this bill, and I have to say that it's fair to say that at the outset, when the notion was first put up that the government was contemplating relaxing the rules around fencing, there was a little bit of consternation, but as we got into the bill and had a good read, we could see where the bill, where the government's intentions seem to be focused anyway. Reducing, where do I start? Look at my notes. Reducing compliance burden imposed on pool owners and territorial authorities or councils. Well, we have to say that gets a tick from the start point. It's a good thing if we can remove compliance. It's interesting that central government, Parliament, has a habit of passing legislation and then passing the problem of enacting and regulating and managing that legislation onto local governments without any thought or consideration whatsoever to the compliance costs that they are foisting upon the local government and thereby upon the ratepayers. Also a bit galling when the same government runs around and criticises the councils for raising rates without recognising the component that they contribute to it by increasing compliance costs, by burdening those councils with heavy compliance costs. So this move gets a tick right at the start. I guess, of course, the key is whilst maintaining child safety, and that is the area where New Zealand First will work with other colleagues at the Select Committee, with Scott Simpson as the chair, and that's an area that we're scrutinising. We do have to note, though, that since the enactment of the Fencing of Swimming Pools Act in 1987, it was interesting reading the paper that said that it had contributed well to reducing the number of drownings of children aged 0 to 4 from 100 in the 10 years before the Act was enacted to 30 in the 10 years prior to 2012. Interesting, I say, because that is, I would assume, against a backdrop of a vastly increased population and an increase in the number of swimming pools in homes. So I just put on the record that that figure, whilst it looks good, reducing from 100 to 30 over two 10-year snapshots prior to enactment and post-enactment, one needs to also consider the increase in the population, which is quite substantial from 1987 till 2012, and also look at the increase in the number of privately owned swimming pools, baths and hot tubs. And we know in certain electorates that support the National Party, there's probably truckloads of those things. You know, these guys got money to burn and enjoy a very luxurious lifestyle. But for the average New Zealander, maybe in places like, you know, well, I won't name places, but in other suburbs around New Zealand, you probably won't see a lot of hot tubs and spa pools around the back beside the Mercedes or the BMW. But if one looks at the increase in those the numbers of those pools and tubs and swimming pools, that is actually an outstandingly successful piece of legislation, one would have to say. So again, the focus will be on making these changes, sensible changes, without in any way degrading the standards of safety. Anything that addresses duplication, inconsistencies in legislation that is cumbersome and onerous to manage has got to be a good thing and gets New Zealand First tick of approval at that point. And so again, we will work constructively to reduce duplication, inconsistency and any cumbersome parts of the legislation, or the two pieces of legislation which have up until now been conflicting. Again, focusing still on the safety aspects, but we would say to the House that we will look to commit ourselves to working constructively on that committee in order to achieve or reduce those things. What else can we say? Addressing outdated legislation does not Oh yes, addressing outdated legislation that does not cater to changes in technology, changes in manufacturing techniques, what has become the standard and the norm in the market, sounds perfectly sensible to us. The safety mechanisms applied, or the safety design of covers these days as relates to hot tubs and spa baths and remuera and that, I guess the technology's moved on. Manufacturers have a different view these days. Child safety is paramount in the eyes, we assume, of companies who want their brands to be recognised as good brands, safe items to have in their family. Hot tubs and pools that will not kill their children. And as technology and as the design has advanced, in some ways it clearly has made the legislation a little bit outdated. And so tidying that up seems eminently sensible to us. Looking through the other factors that the government's aiming to address, clarifying that councils should inspect swimming pools yearly. Interesting. Let's see what the local government New Zealand has to say about that. I'm anticipating that they will give a nod of approval because again it reduces compliance costs. Replacing the current offence provisions involving court proceedings with a more cost-effective graduated enforcement regime that includes prosecutable offences seems worth considering as far as New Zealand First is concerned. Relying on performance-based standards in the building code to specify the requirements for restricting access to pools rather than the current duplicate and inconsistent requirements, again, seems sensible to us. Requiring retailers and manufacturers to inform buyers about their obligations under the Act when they buy spa pools, hot tubs and portable pools, so as to encourage voluntary compliance, goes on. Interesting. It would be interesting to see the views of retailers and manufacturers. Interesting that this government in particular wants to push that responsibility back to the retailer, back to the business people, back to the manufacturer. So we'll listen with interest to what those people have to say. And I guess on the other hand, and balancing that, this will please local government. I'm anticipating that this will please local government New Zealand. So we'll no doubt in committee have a bit of a conversation about the Balancing Act, about moving the compliance from local government New Zealand across to business New Zealand, and I have no doubt that Phil O'Reilly will turn up and say this is a bad thing, and government is passing on red tape and compliance to business New Zealand. But I think we think this is a sensible conversation to have, and at the end of the day, one could be forgiven for saying that if a manufacturer produces an item, it is their responsibility to ensure that not only is the item or the hot tub or spa bath or pool safe for consumers to use, but it's safe for them to sell, and that they do carry some responsibility to advise the prospective buyer of their responsibilities as well. So all in all, we'll support the bill, the legislation to Select Committee. We'll have that conversation in the Select Committee. It does appear to us that it does reduce compliance costs for councils, which is something that I'm quite happy to support myself. But let's see where we go from there, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
I call Paul